This is a lecture on Middle English literature and history. So, a bit of a timeline. Last time, the Old English era ends in 1066 with the defeat of Harold by William the Conqueror, William of Normandy. And so this is called 1066, the Norman Conquest. And French becomes the dominant language and culture of England. The Anglo-Saxon nobility are almost completely wiped out and they're replaced with French nobility. And French becomes the language spoken by the elite, spoken by the aristocrats. Um, Everybody in power will speak French. And this will have a huge impact on the English language. Today, almost 30% of the words in English are French in origin. So that Old English, which looked like almost a completely foreign language, is going to, over the next 200 to 300 years, start to look a lot more like something we would recognize. It'll start to become Middle English. In the 1180s, Marie de France writes her lays, and we'll read L'Envol at the end of next week. Magna Carta 1215 is really important for establishing the relationship between the king and the barons or the nobles and how they're going to share power. The conquest of Wales in 1284 adds Wales to England to become, what will eventually become Great Britain. In 1290, the Jews are expelled from England. There's a lot of anti-Semitism at this time, and so most of the Jews, not every single person, are exiled from England. In 1337, the 100 Years' War with France begins. It's not a perfect 100 years. It'll be kind of on again, off again, but this conflict with France will last for a long time. 1348, probably the most important thing that happens in this century, the Black Death. I think they estimate close to 25% of the population of Europe is wiped out. It has an absolutely huge effect on everything. Then at the end of the 14th century, we have Gawain and the Green Knight, Geoffrey Chaucer writing. By the time we get to 1400, English is the main language of Britain, and we'll kind of like end this Middle English period when we get to the morality play Everyman, which was kind of late 1490s. So that's just a snapshot of history and where the literature that we'll be reading fits into it. This gives you a picture of what the map looks like for William the Conqueror. All that pink stuff is what he conquers around 1066. Notice that there is stuff across the channel. Normandy, parts of Brittany, parts of what are today France. This was all part of England. And other parts of England that we think of parts of England, these parts in the blue, are kind of, they're not exactly independent countries, but they kind of have independent rulers. They're called Palatine states. And Wales is not yet, Wales, Scotland, Ireland are not yet officially part of England. Wales comes in, as I said, but it'll be a while before Scotland becomes part of Great Britain. So what exists as England looks a little different than what we're used to. Characteristics of Middle English literature. Impersonality. Again, when we talked about that question about the narrator in Beowulf, a kind of impersonal narrator just telling you what's happening. We have a mixed audience. Unlike Beowulf or The Wanderer or even The Dream of the Rood, which were, we think about that mead hall culture, poems to be sung in the mead hall. The mead hall is almost all male. Court is not. Court is a mixed gender audience. So we definitely have women in the audience for these stories. The church is more central. Religion is at the center of literature. Morality, literature has a moral purpose. Even when it's not directly religious, there is an idea that you should learn something or that it should express morality, and it is still an oral tradition. Formal characteristics. We start to see more allegory. And an allegory is where you have a story that has one level that is very literal and another level that is very symbolic. And sometimes abstract ideas or virtues or vices or types of people are personified. We'll definitely see that in the play Everyman. But you'll see someone like Lady Virtue or, a character that clearly represents an abstract concept. And we see what are called exemplum, moral anecdotes that are used to illustrate something. Again, this literature is didactic. It's meant to teach. We see romance, and that doesn't mean romance novels like we might think of them today with, heaving bosoms and happily ever afters. These are stories that focus on knights, chivalry, quests. They may include love, a knight's love for his lady. The settings are imaginary and kind of vague, almost fairy tale like the woods or a castle. There's a lot of mystery and suspense from supernatural elements. Sometimes there are concealed or disguised identities. The stories of King Arthur and his court are the example of romances. These kinds of stories. They're not realistic. We see dragons and witches and magical spells and things like that. Again, oral. We will also see frame tales, certainly when we get to Chaucer, a story that has other little stories within it. Morality play in drama, a dramatized allegory of Christian life, where we'll see, morality embodied in these kind of abstract figures and played out before us. In that introductory reading on the Middle Ages, they also talked about how this society and culture was organized. And one way of thinking, and you may have encountered this in social studies classes in high school, is this idea of the three estates: the church, the aristocracy, and the peasants. That is all pretty simple. Another way, and certainly a way some people at the time talked about society, was this idea of the social body, that there was like your units, your group. It could be a nation. It could be even smaller than a nation because nations aren't kind of a fully realized idea, where you have the king, the priests, the princes. They're the head, right? They determine where everybody's going. They do all the thinking. The townspeople are the heart. The knights are one arm, and merchants are the other. And of course, the peasants and workers are the feet. They're at the bottom. This is very hierarchical, but this idea that all of these people come together to do important functions like if they were one body. Certainly by the end of the 14th century, we will see more merchants, a bigger merchant class, something that looks to us a little bit more like a middle class than you would have seen in Old English. Speaking of, that group that makes the head, here is a picture of King Arthur and his very famous round table. And I want to talk very quickly about some ideas about chivalry. Leon Gautier is a French historian who wrote a book on chivalry, and he talks about the 10 commandments of the code of chivalry. I'm not going to read them all. You certainly do not need to write them all down. But I want you to notice that while some of them seem kind of generic, like you should be generous and, give largesse to everyone. You should love your country. You should be honest, right? You should never lie. Some of these are also pretty specific about the relationship to the church, and you should defend the church. You believe everything the church teaches. You should make war against the infidel without cessation and without mercy. This is militant Christianity. And chivalry, this comes from chevalier, the French word for horse, right? Cheval. People who ride horses, knights. This is all connected to soldiers and knights and the people who fight. And it is explicitly, again, militant Christianity. So that's this code of chivalry. It's not kind of the way we think of chivalry today. It's just like manners or like holding the door open for someone. This is more specific and more ideological. Think about when we get to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, how some of these codes are important. Being honest, never lying, being generous, always being the champion of right against injustice, and not recoiling or showing weakness to the enemy. Think about the difficulty Sir Gawain has in kind of living up to this code. The code of chivalry is very important for Middle English literature, and this idea of courtly love is also very important. And here is this like nice picture of this lady giving an incredibly fancy helmet to this soldier in front of her. You can see his shield and his horse, his war horse, right, with all of its kind of armor on. And so this is this idea of a knight and his lady and courtly love. Do not write this all down, but what you do need to write down is this writer, this medieval writer, Andreas Capellanus, writes a book called The Art of Courtly Love, and it has these perceptions, ideas about what courtly love should be. Now, obviously, at this time, we do not have the ideal of marriage where you're marrying your soulmate or your best friend. Marriages are made for dynastic and political and logical reasons. It's a lot more arranged marriage. So courtly love does not imagine marriage between two married people. It is by definition between two people who are not married to each other. And notice that the first rule is that marriage is no real excuse for not loving. Just because you're married to someone doesn't mean you shouldn't be loving other people. Most of these things are things that today we would say are not a healthy relationship. Being obsessed with the person you're in love with, being jealous. We do not think of this as an ideal, but this is this ideal portrayal of courtly love, right? It's based on jealousy. It's kind of obsessive, right? You only think about your lover. You only do that which will please your lover. You you can't eat, you can't sleep, you feel pale, you're worried all the time. Your love is either growing or fading. Um, Love is secret. When made public, love rarely endures. Love is something that's secret. If it's easily attained, it's of little value, right? It's difficult. Your lover may not return your love. So these ideals, yeah, these are not things we think of as a healthy relationship. But this ideal of courtly love, and it's perhaps mostly something one might see in literature and perhaps not in real life. But again, the stories of King Arthur's court, of Lancelot and Guinevere and Arthur, and that famous love triangle, of Tristan and Isolde in Irish literature. Like, all of these stories kind of are influenced by this idea of courtly love. And think about this too as we get into the relationship between Sir Gawain and the lady of the castle. So, in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, this is an Arthurian story, but King Arthur is not the main character, and it comes from the 14th century. So, it's a Middle English text. Like Beowulf, it's just written down in the one manuscript. There is one manuscript that has this poem in it, and people found it, and it's incredibly important. And it actually, it was like on the practically the same shelf as the Beowulf manuscript, and it too almost got burned in that fire. We don't have a named author. We have an anonymous author. The book that this poem appears in also has 3 other poems: Pearl, Patience, and basically Cleanliness is how you would translate that title. So and all of these poems, they believe were written by the same person. So we call the author the Pearl Poet, after the other poem that this author wrote. This is part of what is called the alliterative revival. And that's an important phrase. You should definitely be writing that down. In fact, all this stuff on the slide you should be writing down. It says revival, but it's hard, like alliterative verse kind of like never went out of fashion. That alliteration that we saw in Beowulf and Old English, that Anglo-Saxon poetic heritage, we will see again in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. This poem has a very particular stanza formation that's called a bob and a wheel, and I'll talk to you about that in a minute when I can show you what it looks like. And we believe the poem was composed near the border with Wales. And remember, Arthurian material, King Arthur is a figure out of Celtic legend, out of Irish legend, out of Welsh legend, out of French literature. King Arthur stories come out of lots of these different overlapping cultures in this region. This is the bob and the wheel, and you need to be able to recognize this. So the bob, like in Gawain, you'll see we'll have a lot of lines that are pretty long and have that alliteration. Like you can see the now I am faulty and falsa and fairda hath been ever. Faulty, false, fairda, right? That FFF alliteration. And then we get this little 2-word line, and care. That's the bob. And then we'll have these 4 lines, shorter lines that rhyme in this A-B-A-B-A rhyme scheme. That's the wheel. So this poem has a very specific stanza formation. This is just showing you that kind of border of that Welsh border where we think this poem was written. It was not written near London. It was written in this other kind of more northwestern area of England. Let's talk about King Arthur's court and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It reflects the Arthurian tradition, chivalry, courtly love, supposedly, right, that Camelot, and think about the way Camelot is discussed in this poem, is a better time than the current 14th century in which this poem is being written, right? That King Arthur's court was a kind of golden past from which we have fallen away. And considering that Arthur is supposedly a kind of 6th century king, I mean, we're really talking about almost 1,000 years in the past. Not quite, but a long time ago. A long, long time ago. As you read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, think about whether this claim that Camelot was better than now, does the poet really think that? Is the poet being sincere? Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is also known for the way it describes nature and the supernatural. And we talked about this a little bit with Beowulf and characters not having what we would think of as interiority. Compare the characters in this story to the ones that we saw in Beowulf in terms of their kind of like thoughts and feelings and how much information we get about what's going on inside their minds. Let's talk about the Green Man. The Green Man, in this case, in the poem, it will be the Green Knight, but the Green Man is a figure right out of pagan culture, out of folklore. It's usually a fertility symbol. This little picture that looks like a stone with a face with leaves, this is a stone carving from a medieval church. And in lots of English churches, you will see some kind of representation of the Green Man in the church in a way, like we talked about, those pagan cultural symbols being incorporated into Christianity. In the poem, and he is a fertility symbol, the Green Man has a branch of holly. And so, right, like holly is something that is green in the winter. It doesn't die in the winter. The Green Man often represents, right, the life force, the regenerative power of nature, right? The leaves come and then they fall and the trees are bare and then spring comes and the cycle starts all over again. So think about, as we read the poem, where do we start with the Green Knight and where do we end with the Green Knight? Other elements that you should watch for as you read: comparisons between King Arthur's court and the natural world, comparisons of Arthur's court and Bertilac's court, a comparison of Gawain and the Green Knight. The poem will have a kind of two-part structure where at the beginning we start in Camelot and the Green Knight comes in and he's the stranger in court. And then in the second half of the poem, Gawain is going to travel to another court and he will be the stranger at that court. Ideals for masculinity. How should an ideal knight behave? Ideals for femininity. How should an ideal woman behave? And what is women's place in chivalric society? And think about the kind of cyclical nature of time and also society. We actually start by discussing Troy and then Camelot. And these are empires, these are that have risen and fallen. So is time degenerative? Are we falling away from a golden past that we can never recover? Or is it regenerative, in a kind of explicitly Christian way, that we will rise above our flaws to create better selves? So think about these things as you read the poem for Friday.